Welcome to Edinburgh Fortean Society, our first ever online event. Normally we meet on the second Tuesday of every month in a pub in Edinburgh. Most recently it's been the Beehive in the Grassmarket, and hopefully when the current situation is over we're intending returning there. My name's Gordon Rutter, for those of you who've not met me before, and I organise the events for the Edinburgh Fortean Society. Tonight I thought we'd have a look at the life of the man who we're all named after. So ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoy The Weird World of Charles Fort. Charles Hoy Fort is Don Quixote, tilting at the windmills of established science, questioning, calling into doubt and collecting anomalous data to push and probe the boundaries of science. Once upon a time we thought the sun revolved around the earth. Someone questioned this. We now know that the earth revolves around the sun. This is how science works: observation, hypothesis, testing, and always questioning. Questioning for alternative explanations, other ways to interpret the data. And this is what Fort did and his followers still do. They call into question scientific ideas by collecting data, sometimes data that is ignored by mainstream science, data of the damned as Fort called it. Fort collected data, looked for patterns, and he questioned all possible interpretations, including his own. As Fort said in his 1932 book Law, I conceive of nothing in religion, science, or philosophy that is more than the proper thing to wear for a while. Fort polarised people. He has been described as the most fascinating literary figure since Poe, and also as one of the most damnable bores who ever cut scraps from out-of-the-way newspapers. What is it about Fort that divides people? What drove his philosophy, and what is his legacy? As has been said, the beginning is a very good place to start, so we shall start with the beginning of Fort himself. In the early 1870s, grocer Charles Nelson Fort married Agnes Hoy, and on the 6th of August 1874 they had the first of their 3 children, Charles Hoy Fort. Raymond and Clarence soon followed. Agnes died a few weeks after the birth of Clarence in 1878. This initially left the boys to be brought up by their father. Charles Sr. was a distant figure, more concerned with discipline and punishment than loving his children. Charles Fort wrote that he was frequently punished with a dog whip. He accepted this as normal, although he did object when the butt end of the whip was used. The Fort household in Albany, New York, was not, however, without a female presence. The housekeeper, Mrs. Lawson, looked after the boys, leaving matters of discipline to their father. On one occasion Charles was struck so hard by his father that blood poured out from his nose. In reaction to this, Charles ran to the spare bedroom, where he rubbed his face over every surface and piece of furniture. The scene was as gory as that of an axe murder. No report exists as to the punishment for this behaviour. We get such details as these from many parts, an autobiography started by Charles in 1899. Despite his attempts, this was unpublished in his lifetime, although it did lead to Charles meeting Theodore Dreiser, who was to assume an important role later. The manuscript of many parts exists only in a fragmentary form now, and it has been published only once in Fortean Studies. As a young boy, Charles was fascinated by natural history, claiming he wanted to be a naturalist. His father could not see the sense or value of this. Charles was a self-taught taxidermist, hunting and stuffing specimens, some of which he would sell and others he would keep in the hope of building a collection of every American bird, male, female, juvenile, and egg. In 1888, Charles's father remarried. Their new mother, Blanche Whitney, soon, temporarily, won the boys over by buying them stamps for their collections. Shortly after this, Charles had grown so much that in both height and weight he was more than a match for his father. After one attempt at punishment, his father realised that Charles was now too big to physically beat. Charles had fought back and almost forced his father to the floor, so the method of punishment was altered. No longer beating us, but locking us in a little dark room, giving us bread and water, sentencing us to several days or several weeks of solitude. 3 times a day the door would be opened and bread and water would be thrust into darkness. At school, Charles was showing the sort of mind that would eventually bring him to the modicum of fame that he commands. Academically, he was performing poorly and he was the class clown, but he showed a remarkable propensity for the retention of trivia which most others would regard as useless, but which for Charles was the lifeblood of his voracious reading. As well as his interest in natural history, Charles tried his hand at amateur archaeology, a passion for which he had no skill whatsoever, as he totally failed to find any of the Native American relics he sought. Charles did not let this lack of success dishearten him. In fact, he took a remarkably lateral approach to the problem. He emptied his pockets and took objects from the house. He buried these in the garden, placed them in cracks in walls, pried up floorboards to inter items of interest. But this was not for him to later dig up, no. All of these efforts were so that someone 1,000 years in the future would not have the same disappointment that he had. They were specifically laid down for future archaeologists to discover. In 1889, the youngest of the 3 boys, Clarence, was sent to a correctional institution for crimes unspecified. Clarence was 10. Charles was only ever to see Clarence once more before the younger sibling's death in 1917. Perhaps as a reaction to the events surrounding Clarence, Charles's father sent Charles to a YMCA camp at Lake Champlain. For a boy so interested in natural history, this was the best present he could ever have been given, and for a brief period Charles was on friendly terms with his father. Charles ultimately left school without graduating, but one aspect of his aborted academic career impressed 2 people. His ability to write was noted favourably by one of his teachers, Miss North, and an uncle, John S. Hoy, and it was this latter individual who was to engineer the first of many jobs for Charles. At age 17, John Hoy introduced Charles to the editor of the Albany Democrat. Charles wrote extensively for the paper, using many overheard pieces of gossip as the basis of stories. This came to a head when his stepmother refused to talk to him at the dinner table for fear of reading her words in the Democrat the next day. Charles sold his work to other newspapers as well, including some for New York syndication. It was during this period he visited Clarence, a story which he turned into an adventure for the newspapers. As a worker rather than student, Charles had discovered a whole new world. Smoking, drinking and gambling definitely featured in it, and there is suggestive evidence that he consorted with women of whom his father would no doubt disapprove. As a worker rather than a student, Charles had discovered a whole new world. Smoking, drinking and gambling definitely featured in it, and there is suggestive evidence that he consorted with women of whom his father would no doubt disapprove. The confines of home were now too much. In 1892, Charles had his final argument with his father, and after a brief time living with his maternal grandfather, he moved to New York, initially to write for the Brooklyn World. He left this to become editor of the Woodhaven Independent. After the failure of this venture, Charles decided to make use of a small allowance from the estate of his paternal grandfather, another greengrocer. With $25 a month, Charles decided to go travelling. In 1909, Charles told the Albany Argus why he had decided to do this. I was born in Albany, New York, and I stayed in Albany as long as practical. Started out, when I was 19, to wander with a definite purpose. Travelled for 2 years. Made a tangled line on the map 30,000 miles long. All this to accumulate an experience and knowledge of life that would fit me to become a writer. I would get together a vast capital of impressions of life and then invest it. After 2 years of sleeping rough and experiencing life, Charles returned to New York from South Africa, possibly with malaria. In New York he met 2 people. The first was an old man who told him, "You don't want to know something about everybody but everything about somebody." Charles took his advice to heart and believed he had wasted 2 years, because thus ended my first lesson. The other person he met in New York was a woman 4 years his senior, Anna Fillen. They had known each other in the youth, and Anna nursed Charles back to health. They married on October the 26th, 1896. This ended relationships with most of his family, as they believed he'd married beneath his station. Charles and Anna took the cheapest lodgings they could find, and Charles took any work he could get. They tried to sell the house that his grandfather had left him, as there was very little income from it. They were unsuccessful. The wages of a kitchen porter were not enough, and they had to resort to burning furniture to keep warm, and Charles could not hunt for jobs when it was raining, as the holes in his shoes would let the water in. Charles was still writing, but this was not bringing in the necessary money. He decided to try his hand at fiction, and in 1905 Charles sold several fictional short stories to Theodore Dreiser and several other magazine editors. They thought highly of his work. Charles decided to write novels. By 1907 Charles was still troubled with a lack of money, and his diary talks of suicidal thoughts. Financial worries continued, and in 1912 his father died. He left his estate to his wife, Blanche. Charles saw nothing. In 1913 Blanche died. Again, Charles saw nothing. The entire estate went to his younger brother Raymond. During this period, Charles wrote 2 novels, X and Y. Neither were published, and the manuscripts for both were destroyed. From correspondence with Dreiser, it appears that X dealt with the idea of our civilization being controlled by the inhabitants of Mars, an idea of humanity as property which he was to return to as an anomalous work. Y seemed remarkably similar, except this time our civilization was controlled by beings at the South Pole. There were plans for a 3rd novel entitled, yep, you guessed it, Z. Presumably, this would have dealt with our civilization being controlled by beings inhabiting a different location. By his own estimate, Charles wrote over 3.5 million words worth of novels, of which only one, The Outcast Manufacturers, was ever published. This was in 1909. Despite Dreiser's attempts, no publisher was interested. Dreiser still believed in Charles, and in 1915 he had him submitting film scripts. None made it past the submission stage, and then, in 1916, fate dealt a hand that would change the lives of Charles and Anna forever. Frank A. Fort, an uncle, died. A sum of money was divided between Charles, Raymond and Clarence. When Clarence died in 1917 without any family, his share was split between Charles and Raymond. From this time on, Charles and Anna were financially independent. They celebrated by buying furniture rather than burning it. Charles was now free to concentrate on things that interested him. Dreiser encouraged him to work on a publication based on his collection of notes and oddities. Charles had been collecting notes of curious events from newspapers to use as potential fuel for writing, and he wrote the Book of the Damned. Dreiser loved it. As it was not a novel, Dreiser tried a different approach. He took it to the publishers of his own work, Bonney and Liverite, and told them that if they didn't publish it, he would no longer allow them to publish his books. And in 1919, the Book of the Damned hit the streets. In his introduction, Charles explained what he meant by the damned. By the damned, I mean the excluded. We shall have a procession of data that science has excluded. In years preceding the Book of the Damned, Charles, when not at work, had spent his time at public libraries, scouring newspapers, ruining his eyesight, and copying down unusual and anomalous stories. The notes he made were on index cards, and he used a comprehensive system of cataloguing using shoe boxes entirely filling a wall. By 1897, Fort had collected 25,000 notes. In a fit of depression, he destroyed them all. He started collecting material again, and by 1920 he had progressed to a collection of 40,000 notes. In another fit of depression, he burned these notes as well. When Charles had been writing novels, he had been fascinated by the idea of patterns, and this idea drove him in his collection of the damned data. He was convinced there were unsuspected patterns around us, and they would make themselves visible if only we knew where and how to look. To this end, he collected data on unexplained phenomena. He reasoned that if there are unsuspected patterns in the universe, then the only place the patterns could be found is in amongst the data that do not fit known patterns. A search for the unexplained became an obsession. I undertook the job of going through all scientific periodicals from the year 1880 available in the libraries of New York. As I went along, new subjects appeared to me, something queer about some hailstones, the odd and the unexplained in archaeological discoveries and in Arctic explorations. By the time Charles felt he had finished, he realised that there were so many new subjects that presented themselves at the end of the search, or indeed ones that he just missed, that he did the search again, and then again, and he just continued, constantly adding more and more data to his pattern search. He did not know where the pattern would present itself, so all damned data was grist to his mill. His search and his abuse by his father caused him to reject argument by authority. A thing is so because someone from a position of authority claims it to be so did not fit on the broad shoulders of Charles Fort. In his work he gave examples of why this did not fit with him. How did geologists determine the age of rocks? By the fossils in them. How do they determine the age of the fossils? By the rocks they're in. And he summed up Charles Darwin's ideas in his rather succinct "Survivors survive." He told well-attested tales of authority figures holding back advancement by blindly declaring things to be wrong. For example, Voltaire saying fossils were something only an ignorant peasant would believe in. Noted French scientist Antoine Lavoisier dismissed meteorites as being falls of rock from the sky because everyone knew that there were no rocks in the sky. It was not until after his execution during the French Revolution that science accepted meteorites. For some, this rejection of authority figures, particularly in science, is seen as a rejection by Charles Fort of science. This is not true. It was the pomposity of some scientists that dismayed him, not the science. Science is about observing, gathering data, hypothesizing, testing and modifying ideas as new data presents itself. Is this not what Charles was doing? Charles sums it up nicely in his final book, Wild Talents, as, "I conceive of nothing in religion, science or philosophy that is more than the proper thing to wear, for a while." Compare this with the words of Karl Popper, a noted philosopher of science. Every scientific statement must remain tentative forever. It may indeed be corroborated, but every corroboration is relative to other statements which again are tentative. The enemy of Charles Fort was not science, but dogma in all its forms. Once published, the Book of the Damned received rave reviews from some, with people noticing exactly the type of data that was being discussed. After one review appeared in the Times, a reader immediately wrote in to point that out. In the very next edition, there was a report of red rain falling, a subject close to Charles Fort's heart, as was the subject of coincidences. H.G. Wells wrote to Theodore Dreiser that Fort seems to be one of the most damnable bores who ever cut scraps from out-of-the-way newspapers. You can't please everybody. Ben Hecht, in his review for the Chicago Daily News, declared, "I am the first disciple of Charles Fort. Henceforth, I am a Fortean." But what does it mean to be a Fortean? What did Charles Fort write about? Let us take a break from his life story, who gave us the word teleportation, to look at the ideas and content of the 4 Fortean books. The Book of the Damned from 1919, New Lands from 1921, Law from 1931, and Wild Talents from 1932. By collecting reports, Charles discovered there were falls of many things from the sky that should not have been there. Falls of frogs, iron, axes, worms, snakes, periwinkles, bloods, lizards, coffee, turtles, turpentine, fish, flesh, and multicoloured rain, to name but a few. As now, the idea that these things happened because of a localised whirlwind was often trotted out, but Charles was sceptical. Why and how could a whirlwind deposit just frogs in one area, and continually for 2 days, as in one fall of toads witnessed in France in 1922? In a time before the phrases flying saucer and UFO were known, Charles was writing about things seen in the sky, unknown objects in space. But he also found reports of appearances and disappearances of human beings, hence teleportation. Charles looked at spontaneous human combustion, the idea that humans suddenly and inexplicably burst into flames, usually being burnt to death in the process and often without doing damage to the surroundings. At one time this was such an accepted phenomena that Charles Dickens even used it as a plot device to kill Crook in Bleak House. Sea monsters and other aquatic devices such as wheels of light seen from ships but underwater were all collected. For some there is a frustration in the books. There are few explanations offered, but Charles never said he would offer explanations. He was a collector of oddities. He presented data and allowed others to make of it what they would. He looked for patterns, but largely failed to find any. The explanations he came up with were usually tongue-in-cheek, designed to show that even though explanations can be conceived of, it does not mean they are correct. For example, the various falls of objects from the sky Charles ascribed to a Super Sargasso Sea floating above our heads, and invisible. This Super Sargasso Sea would be the depository of all things that go missing, the ultimate recipient of the toads missing from a pond, teleported there of course. And then, just as curiously as they are teleported to the Super Sargasso Sea, they are then teleported back to us as apparent falls from the sky, deposited there by whirlwinds as the ignorant believe. But Charles would poke holes in his own theories to save others the troubles of having to do so. For example, why have falls of tadpoles not been reported? Surely they would be teleported to the Super Sargasso Sea too. In fact, if the whirlwind theory is correct, why are there not falls of tadpoles? Being smaller, they must be easier for the wind to pick up. Each of the 4 anomalistic books are broadly themed. The Book of the Damned, as the first, sets out the main thesis, the observation of ignored data, with many different examples from falls of objects from the skies, disappearances, and what we now call UFOs. New Lands expands on the idea of the Super Sargasso Sea. Law looks mostly at astronomical conundrums and teleportation. In Wild Challenge, Charles largely moves away from the idea of teleportation, preferring instead to ascribe many phenomena to the hidden and untamed powers of the mind. In Stephen King's novel Firestarter, the parents of the pyrokinetic girl are advised to read Wild Talents as an explanation of what is happening to their daughter. A Fortean is a follower of the ideas of Charles Fort, collecting and analysing data, looking for patterns, appreciating the damned and the anomalous. The topics have expanded as our knowledge has expanded. Forteans include study of supposed archaeological materials on Mars and crop circles, matters of which Charles was unaware. Now that we have seen a glimpse of some of the topics of Charles Fort, but only a small selection, as the 4 books cover 1,200 reports, and we know there are some 60,000 notes in existence on his death, we should return to his life story. Presumably we will re-enter the story at a point where publication of Book of the Damned has made Charles a wealthy man. Sadly not. Wealth is not forthcoming from his book. At the start of 1920, we find a letter from Charles to Dreiser saying, "Forces are moving me. I've cut ties with Albany and published in the Tribune my dissatisfaction with the New York Public Library, so that I can't comfortably go back there, and I've burned all my notes, 40,000 of them. Forces are moving me to London." Depression, dissatisfaction, and a desire to start a new life. And move to London they did, taking up residence in Marchmont Street, a mere stone's throw from the British Museum, which at the time housed the British Library, the copyright depository for all published work in Great Britain. Charles may have destroyed his notes, but it was so he could start again. A routine developed. Up at 8, notes till lunchtime, and then from 2 till 5, research at the British Library. Evenings were also approached with a regular routine. Several times a week he and Anna would go to the cinema. Charles claimed that he went merely to keep Anna company. When not there, Charles would spend his evenings at Hyde Park, where he would argue with people, a group some would have called friends, but Charles welcomed the regular arrival at 9 to take him home. As Anna described it, he liked solitude. He did not want anyone to come in, and he did not want to go out. Upon arrival back at Marchmont Street, Charles would read his latest work to Anna. Time was also spent simply gazing at the stars, and drinking would have been part and parcel of their time there as well, although whether this would be Anna's excellent home brew or at some of the local public houses is unclear. After 6 months, Charles and Anna returned to New York, and then in December 1921 they returned to London, and indeed they returned to Marchmont Street, although this time they lodged at number 39 rather than number 15. Charles and Anna remained at this address for 8 years, and in 2015 a blue plaque was unveiled to commemorate this fact. This was a replacement for an unofficial plaque. Charles continued his research routines at the British Library, and his visits to Hyde Park now included speaking at the famed Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park, an area where people still come to proclaim their ideas and others come to harangue or applaud as they see fit. Charles was a collector of data, but there appears to be one incident where he may have experienced a poltergeist, or magic, in Marchmont Street. In March 1924, Charles was quietly reading when he heard a picture fall from the wall. It was undamaged, having landed on a pile of magazines. But upon inspecting it, one of the fastenings on the back of the picture had broken in 2 separate places. Anna informed him that 2 pictures had mysteriously fallen in the flat above. 6 days later, Charles heard a loud shatter of breaking glass, but upon inspection he could find no damaged glass. So loud was the sound being that the occupant of the flat above also heard it. 10 days later, another picture was found on the floor. It had fallen from above his stored boxes of notes, but it had not hit them. Had it done so, the notes would have been strewn across the floor. This was not the case. The cord holding the picture had snapped. Charles repaired it and tried to repeat the event by pulling on the picture to snap the cord. It refused to budge. In mid-April, Anna was cleaning, and as she reached for a picture to wipe the glass, it appeared to jump into her hands. Cord, nail, and fastening were all intact, and they could think of no way in which the picture could have come loose. In October, Charles noted that he was idly staring at the kitchen wall, toying with a piece of string, when suddenly a picture in his line of sight fell off the wall, and this time it did hit the boxes of notes on its way down. The frame and glass broke, and upon inspection it was found that the cord had snapped. But when Charles looked at it, he realised there was not enough cord left. There was a middle section of cord that should have been present missing, and it would have been several inches in length. Pictures continued to fall until they stopped for no reason. And then, in November 1926, whilst Charles was out discussing mysterious falling pictures with some friends, another picture fell, scaring Anna. Charles put these incidences down to magic, suspecting that he himself was the magician. Attempting to replicate his magical powers when back in New York in 1929, after a pan fell whilst he and Anna were discussing falling pictures, he had no success. Another attempt yielded the same results. Charles had tried to awaken his powers by reading out notes of falling pictures to see if he could encourage pictures to fall. He concluded that he was not actually a wizard, and as such he would not let anyone else tell them that they were a wizard. In 1923, Charles's second work on the anomalous, New Lands, was published. In 1926, science fiction author Edmund Hamilton wrote to Fort, and Charles replied, "It is quite as you say. Poor old theology hammered all around, but science the great immune. And so far as I know, mine are about the only books of impoliteness to scientific dogmas by one who has not the theological bias. Every now and then I get a letter from somebody who thinks I am some kind of fundamentalist, simply because I don't take in without questioning everything that the scientists tell us." This sums up Charles Fort's approach to his work, or his mission. Hamilton seems to have asked about some sort of group or gathering of like-minded individuals, Hecht's Forteans. Charles did not seem to be in favour of the idea. "I am very glad to know of your interest in the subject, but that we shall ever organise does not seem likely to me. The great trouble is that the majority of persons who are attracted are the ones that we do not want. Spiritualists, fundamentalists, persons who are revolting against science, not in the least because they are affronted by the myths stuff of the sciences, but because scientists either oppose or do not encourage them. I accept, myself, that there are psychic phenomena, and I think that Daniel Hume, for instance, did have occult powers, but psychic phenomena and occult powers and alleged communications with the dead are in very different categories in my view. Again, Charles Fort is not anti-science, he is anti-dogma. With the success of the Book of the Damned, people had taken to sending clippings to Charles himself, giving him a greater range of materials than he may ever have thought possible. By October 1929, Charles and Anna had returned to New York, specifically 2051 Rye Avenue in the Bronx. By the end of this year, despite the Wall Street crash, Charles was still financially secure, although not wealthy, but he still wanted to write. Unfortunately, he felt that this pleasure would soon be robbed of him. "I think that I too am coming to an end. My general health is very good, but I am almost blind in the right eye, and the left eye is going. I have gone over my papers and sorted them, and packed away all of my notes." In his diary entry from 1929, Charles goes on to say he cannot stand to live in blindness, and that he felt he had read his last book. He also relates that just before returning from London, his library work had stopped on account of eye strain. He was now devoting his work time in producing a game of super checkers, similar to normal checkers but on a board with thousands of squares and a prodigiously large number of counters. In theory, the game could take several weeks to play, although with some tweaks Charles managed to get it down so that the average game lasted an entire evening. This game never caught on. In 1930, an author and friend of Charles's, Tiffany Thayer, encouraged him to send a manuscript which he knew already existed to his publishers. Charles sent it, and the publishers liked the book, although they did not like the proposed title, Skyward Ho! One reason for disliking the title was that books on aviation were a poor seller at the time. Needless to say, the book was not about aviation. The publishers suggested God is an idiot, but Charles vetoed this. Many titles were suggested until eventually Thayer came up with Law. In January 1931, Law was published. It was in celebration of the publication of Law that Tiffany Thayer founded the first Fortean Society. They had their first meeting at the Savoy Plaza on the 26th of January 1931. The idea of such a society had first been raised by Thayer with Charles in November 1930, and Charles refused to have anything to do with it. "I wouldn't join it any more than I'd be an elk." By a series of subterfuges and fake telegrams, Charles was tricked into attending this inaugural meeting of a society that had been set up to perpetuate and promote Charles and his work, to preserve Charles's note collection, and to add to it, and finally to encourage dissent. When the society met, Thayer chaired, and Charles occasionally, begrudgingly, took part. Despite Charles's worry about his health, he continued to write, and in 1932 he completed his fourth catalogue of anomalies, Wild Talents. During the writing of this book, Charles remained a meticulous note-taker, this time about the progress of his ill health. He used the same index cards to use for his anomalous note-taking. He recorded periods of weakness, so bad that he was unable to go for his customary walks. He cut down on smoking, on meals, and on beer. Eventually, he cut down on writing, working only in mornings. On February the 20th, 1932, he completed the manuscript for Wild Talents. The last note from Charles on the 26th of February simply says, "New difficulty in shaving gaunt places in my face." Despite withdrawing from all aspects of his life and taking to bed for most of the time, Charles refused to see a doctor. On May the 3rd, he was so weak Anna overruled him and called for an ambulance, which took him to the Royal Hospital. The publisher of Wild Talents brought some advance copies of the work for Charles to see, but he was unable to raise his hand to accept them. He died later that day. He was buried in the family plot at Albany. Anna lived for a further 5 years, dying aged 67, before she was interred next to him. Anna left money to be used as grants for deserving students in memory of her husband. When he died, Charles was 58, and modern eyes suggest that his symptoms point to leukemia. So that is the life of Charles Fort and some of his interests. But what is his legacy? What has happened since 1932? Some areas where Fortean ideas have reared their head have already been mentioned, but Charles is ever present in our society. The Fortean Society, founded by Tiffany Thayer, continued. In 1935, Thayer found he had more time to devote to it and wrote to Theodore Dreiser suggesting a magazine. Members could keep in touch with each other and share findings. Charles's original notes would be published, presumably with an eventual aim of all 60,000 seeing the light of day. The magazine was to be called The Fortean, and Thayer wanted Dreiser to write the first article, or at least to have the first article about Dreiser, naming you as Fort's discoverer and the first friend of his genius. Thayer felt that this would be the only way to get the original notes out, as no one would be interested in publishing them as a book. Dreiser was not happy. He refused to have anything to do with the society. Dreiser was not impressed with Thayer, specifically for his removal of all of Charles's notes before anyone else had had a chance to peruse them. Dreiser was very disparaging about Thayer, the society and its founder members. "I do not see any name on the list of founders that would be likely to achieve anything but a ridiculous imitation of Fort, nothing that would in any way interfere with the sound and just progress of his ultimate fame." Dreiser felt the whole venture was only set out to promote the fame of Thayer and not Fort. Thayer replied that he had a letter from Charles asking him to take collection of the notes on his death. This did not placate Dreiser, who asked for his name to be removed from the Fortean Society, although he did concede that if he could be of help in the future in connection with Fort and his material, he would be glad to assist. The Fortean Society magazine first appeared in September 1937. There was no mention of Theodore Dreiser. As promised, the magazine published copies of the notes transcribed by Thayer. It also included articles of a Fortean nature. The first was on the disappearance of Amelia Earhart, and initially it included material that might be of interest to future Forteans, for example, actual tides versus predicted tides of New York. By 1940, this latter aspect had disappeared, perhaps into the Super Sargasso Sea. Fortean occurrences were still covered, transcribed notes were still published, and the journal had picked up an English correspondent, the future science fiction author Eric Frank Russell. But the tone had changed. Thayer started to use it to air his political views, chiefly against the Second World War and civil defence. In 1941, the Fortean Society magazine announced the publication in America of a collected edition of Charles's 4 anomalous catalogues, the Books of Charles Fort. In 1944 to 1945, the winter edition, the magazine changed its name to Doubt. Thayer deliberately encouraged cranks as he felt they made for interesting reading, although he was not without certain idiosyncratic ideas himself. For example, he felt that all of the planets of the solar system were constantly growing by flipping from a spherical to a cube form and then back again. Along with Eric Frank Russell, other budding science fiction authors were members of the Society, for example James Blish. Blish is perhaps best known today for his novelisations of the original Star Trek scripts, but he was an author of his own Fortean-themed works too. Other writers of the time may not have been members, but they were definitely followers of Fort. Chief of these must be Arthur C. Clarke, who also collected anomalous data and wrote several books on Fortean ideas and presented a number of TV series. In between campaigning against vaccination and the Korean War, Thayer had time to introduce a 13-month calendar, with the extra month inserted between August and September, and to be called Fort. Admitting the idea was not his own, it was first proposed by Moses B. Cotsworth in 1943, Thayer pointed out that the only reason the original suggestion named the new month Sol was that Cotsworth was unaware of the importance of Fort. In 1949, Doubt celebrated the marriage of 4 couples, all of whom had met their partners through membership of the Society. 2 of these were eventually to be published authors. Vincent Gaddis wrote on Fortean topics, popularising still further Charles Fort and his works, and inventing the phrase Bermuda Triangle. The second was Sam Yude, who wrote as John Christopher, and is best known as the creator of the series The Tripods, although many of his books feature Fortean themes. In 1949, Thayer attacked the founding of groups to carry on the work of Fort. He noted these were not part of the Fortean Society and were not in any way official. 50 members in San Francisco immediately resigned and continued meeting for a couple of years until they ran out of steam. One of Thayer's problems with these groups was that they were interested in Fortean phenomena and not in other things. In other words, they did not ascribe to Thayer's political views. The last issue of Doubt was issue 61, published in the spring of 1959. In August of that year, the 57-year-old Thayer died of a heart attack. No one took over the reins of the Fortean Society, but as Eric Frank Russell pointed out, the Society was never dissolved, and so technically it still exists. But even if we do declare this original society dead, there are others who keep the name and work of Charles Fort alive. In the early 1960s, the International Fortean Organisation, INFO, was founded by 2 writers, Ron and Paul Willis. When they started, they acquired much of the material in the keep of Tiffany Thayer, so this is the closest we have to a direct descendant of Thayer's society. An article in the Washington Post said, "Its membership ranges from hardcore skeptics to top scholars to true believers, but its cornerstone is open-mindedness." This sounds to be a typical makeup of a group of Forteans. In 1967, Info started to publish their own in-house journal, the Info Journal, Science and the Unknown. In the early 1970s, Info started producing books, many of which contained reprints of articles from the journal. At the same time, they organised get-togethers where like-minded individuals could meet and hear lectures on topics of mutual interest. Info no longer publishes a journal, but Fort Fests, as they call their gatherings, still happen. Info member and Fortean author John Keel set up a New York Fortean Society in 1987. The newsletter lasted until 1989, but informal meetings continued into the 1990s. In 1999, the Charles Fort Institute was founded in London, dedicated to preserving and continuing the work of Charles Fort. In the same year, the Edinburgh Fortean Society was founded, and they have held monthly meetings and several-day conferences ever since, making them possibly the second most active Fortean Society after Info. From 2011, a London Fortean Society now meets on a monthly basis too. There are other groups who have Fortean ideals at their heart, but they have tended to narrow their interests. For example, there is the Centre for Fortean Zoology and their annual conference. There are also a myriad of UFO groups and paranormal groups. When it comes to publishing, there are 2 magazines which are long-lived, still publishing, and happy to describe themselves as Fortean. Firstly, there is the American published Fate, founded in 1948 by Raymond A. Palmer and Curtis Fuller. In Great Britain, Bob Rickard founded The News in 1973. This was subsequently renamed Fortean Times. Sporadically, the Fortean Times has held a meeting called the Unconvention, featuring a weekend of speakers from all aspects and all sides, believer and sceptic, of the Fortean world. There are a wealth of books published on Fortean themes, and as has already been mentioned, Fortean ideas have been used in all areas of popular culture. William Corliss has continued the work of collecting anomalous data and publishing it in his many catalogues. Since the death of Corliss, these have now ceased. Charles Fort has appeared in comics, including 2000 AD and his own comic with his helpful sidekick, H.P., noted horror author H.P. Lovecraft as a boy, no less. This sets Charles out as more of an Indiana Jones character rather than the bookish scholar he actually was. Robert Zemeckis, director of the Back to the Future films, is keen to film these comics. Some films take single ideas from the works of Fort and run with them. Others have a whole full script of Forteana. For example, Magnolia starts by quoting Fort on coincidence and ends with one of Fort's beloved Falls of Frogs. Many television shows take their themes from Charles Fort, but only one has fully embraced this in naming itself Fortean TV. 3 series were produced by Channel 4 in the UK and presented by the Reverend Lionel Fanthorpe, a prodigious writer of Fortean texts. The word Fortean now has its own entry in the dictionary. The ideas of teleportation and the word, invented by Charles, are now well known to most, courtesy of the many uses in science fiction. The idea of teleportation has of course been taken up by television series such as Star Trek as a plot device. You can instantly get characters from point A to point B. It's also cheaper than having to insert some special effects spaceships to show people moving from location to location. Research in universities is carried out on the realities of teleportation. But the Super Sargasso Sea has been taken on board too, although generally not by that name. The Star Trek cartoon featured a location where spaceships from around the galaxy disappeared to, an idea used essentially unchanged in the final episode of Star Trek Voyager. Doctor Who has featured the effect with a graveyard of spaceships in the brain of Morbius with Tom Baker as the Doctor. Matt Smith in The Doctor's Wife, written by Neil Gaiman, features a Super Sargasso Sea outside our universe. DC and Marvel Comics have both used the idea, as have writers of science fiction such as Bertram Chandler in Into the Alternate Universe. The first Fortean-inspired short story is believed to be The Thing from Outside by George Allen England in 1923, and the first Fortean novel is The Earth Owners by Edmund Hamilton in 1931. Apparently, when a Beatles fan is asked what modern music is influenced by the Fab Four, the answer is all of it. It sometimes feels that way with the works of Charles Fort. Many influences are overt and easy to see, some are subtle, and then another class are indirect. A catalogue of relevant works would no doubt run to many thousands of pages. And talking of catalogues, the life work of Charles Fort was cataloguing the damned data. Ultimately, he produced 60,000 3-inch by 5-inch card notes. Some were published in doubt, but the majority have never been seen. The collection now resides at the New York Public Library, where Charles did much of his research. Never digitised and not easy to access. But in the 1970s and 80s, Carl Pabst transcribed each and every one. He tried to sell these copies for a dramatically high price. No one was willing to pay. However, upon Pabst's death, the copies were abandoned in his old home and they were rescued days before they were going to be destroyed by the new owners. John Reed of the World Institute for Scientific Exploration is the rescuer, and the plan is to put the notes online as a free resource for all. So, Charles Fort may not have had a long life, from 6th of August 1874 to the 3rd of May 1932, and in terms of published works he may not be the most prolific author, but in terms of ideas and their influence, he ranks among the greats. His writing is a strange style. His humour is not understood by all, but his impact behind the scenes is unrivalled. I leave the last word to Fort and his final book, Wild Talents. Sometimes I am a collector of data, and only a collector, and I am likely to be gross and miserly, piling up notes, pleased with merely numerically adding to my stores. Other times I have joys, when unexpectedly coming upon an outrageous story that may not be altogether a lie, or upon a macabre little thing that may make some reviewer of my more or less good works mad. But always there is present a feeling of unexplained relation of events that I note. And it is this far away, haunting or often taunting awareness or suspicion that keeps me piling on. So, I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope you'll think of coming back next month when we have our next talk. And what I thought we'd do for next month is have a Fortean themed quiz. There will be easy questions, there will be difficult questions as well, and there'll also be a bit of fun and games as we go along as well. So hopefully you're all well and you're getting on as much as you can do. I'm going to try and keep things regular with the Edinburgh Fortean Society so that it gives a bit of normality to life. Stay safe, everyone. Thank you very much. Bye.